Okay, we can start the webinar. Hopefully we'll, hi Bill, I'm glad you joined us. So my name is Kiara Yates, and I'm a snow instructor. I've been working with snow since 2012, for those of you who are joining for the first time. And the first part of the webinar, we're going to go over ECHO 201 and Milestone 3. So we're going to do microeconomics. You've worked on Milestone 1, you've worked on Milestone 2, and you've so far have analyzed the demand and the supply trends for the firm. In this section, in this milestone, you have a couple of rubric elements. The first element that you'll be examining are the costs of production. The cost of production, so the COGS, the so-called COGS, cost of goods sold, you'll be able to find the information for them in the financial reports for your company. You'll be able to go in the actual financial report where they have all the numbers, and you'll be able to find some of this information. If you look on this sample paper, there's a link that says how to read the income statement that you'll be able to click, and it'll give you additional guidance on how to go over the income statement for the firm and identify the value of the COGS. The other element for the cost of production is the output decisions, and so how the variable costs and fixed costs affect the output decisions for the firm. Now, the two elements of the cost of productions are really tied together, because the cost of goods sold are the variable costs, such as raw material, the labor. So raw materials for Starbucks would be, for example, coffee. Raw materials for Tesla would be the steel to build the cars. So these are considered variable costs. And then there's the fixed costs of the firm, and the fixed costs, which are also part of the cost of production, but the fixed costs are, for example, the cost of rent, so the cost of the plants that the factory operates. The cost of productions determined ultimately the profitability of the firm, especially the variable ones, because they change. So the more you produce, the more the variable costs increase, and there's going to be a point where it won't be profitable. The profits will start decreasing, and it will not be as profitable to produce more units of the good. And reach that point, that's where the firm is going to stop producing. So for this section, for the cost of production, in the first element, you want to examine a trend of the cost of production. So you go back 5 years, exactly the same way you did when you were examining the demand trends. So you want to find the past 5 years of operating expenses. You can provide a table or a graph. It's just going to be easier than try to write everything. And you want to observe what the trends are. So, for example, if there's been changes in the prices of inputs, or there's been a change in the way the goods have been produced. So you want to observe what changes have occurred in the costs of production for your firm, or over time. And when we talk over time, as I said, we're talking usually a 5-year period, which is the same period you would have done for the demand and the supply trends. So once you are identified the cost of production trends, you'll be able to analyze how they affected the profitability of the firm. When you study in your textbook, you'll see that there's a difference between accounting revenue, accounting profit, and economic profit. So you want to keep that in mind. But the accounting profit is, like it says on this sample, is revenue minus costs. So it's just a mathematical equation, while the economic costs consider the non-tangible factors in the company. Once you have gone through the cost, so once you have determined the profitability, that's how you can also examine how this profitability affects the output decisions of the firm, and how the fixed and the variable costs impact the firm, basically. You can find a discussion about fixed and variable costs in chapter 11, and you can see how they apply. If your fixed costs are really high, it's going to highly affect your profitability, and it might cause the company to make some changes. For example, Tesla recently, I think last year, transferred a factory to another area to improve maybe efficiency and profitability of the firm. Oh, Rebecca, you're not hearing me well? Is everybody else hearing me well? Yes? It might be your computer then. Good, I'm glad you can all hear me. Fine. So when you do the second element of the cost of production, you're really not, it's not an element that stands on its own. You will be able to use the research that you carried out to examine the COGS and the operating expenses of the firm, and that research will help you for the second element, and in deciding how these costs affect the output of the decisions. Moving on, after you've examined the cost of production, you will examine the market the firm operates in. So what is the overall market of the, first of all, you want to examine the market share of the firm. So what is the market share? Is the percentage of market, the percentage of market that the firm holds. Your firm might hold a high percentage of the market, like might be dominant firm in the market. It might not. If you're doing Under Armour, for example, although Under Armour seems to be pretty popular and very well known, you might find out that it doesn't hold a big piece of the market compared to Nike, for example. However, it stands its ground. So in the first, you have three elements of the rubric for the overall market for this section. The first of all, I said, will be to examine the market share. If you present the data graphically for the market share, like you have a pie chart or a table or a graph, then you will also be exemplary for the purpose of the final, and you will not have to go back and review this section. So that will help you. Once you have identified the market share, you want to examine what the barriers to entry into that market are. The barriers to entry could be, for example, economies of scale. So if you are in a market like the automotive industry where there's a big economies of scale, that could be a barrier to entry, because it might be difficult for a new automotive company to enter the market. So Tesla entered the market fairly recently compared to other companies, and they were successful in entering the electric car market. So, you know, they were able to overcome the barriers to entry for the automotive market. The same for Under Armour. Under Armour is a fairly new company in the sports equipment industry, and they were able to enter the market and overcome the barriers to entry. The barriers to entry are important because based on what the barriers to entry are, you will be able then to move on and determine what kind of market structure your firm is in. So you will need to know what the market share is in your industry and what the barriers to entry are, to then develop the third part, the third element of the rubric, which is what market structure your company operates in. To determine the market structure, you can use the index that counts the number of firms that dominate the market. And if it's 8 to 10 firms that dominate your market, you probably are looking at an oligopoly. If it's more than that, you're looking at a monopolistic competitive market. And if it's only like one or two firms, you're in a monopoly, or you might be in a duopoly, which is pretty common. David is asking, is research and development a barrier to entry? For example, I'm always going to be able to start manufacturing 7mm CPU with serious R&D for many, many years. David, the research and development can be a barrier to entry. And also, now I don't know about being able to manufacture the 7nm CPU, who manufactures it. If they have a patent on it, then nobody would be able to manufacture until the patent expires, and that creates a barrier to entry. For example, the patents that are barrier to entries are very common in the pharmaceutical industry because they come up with new meds that nobody can sell until the patent expires. I'm not sure which the CPU you're referring to because I'm not very competent in the computer industry. But if someone has developed it and they don't have a patent, then some other company might develop it, and it's not necessarily, you know, it can be a barrier to entry, it cannot be. But that would definitely be an obstacle. Barriers to entries, for example, in a monopolistic competition. So in industries that have a lot of firms that though distinguish themselves mostly for branding, so branding can be a barrier to entry. For example, I don't know, in the toilet paper industry, everybody knows some brands, the softest brands of toilet paper, and entering the toilet paper industry might be challenging because you have to, if you want to be competitive, you have to brand yourself. And branding, name recognition can be a barrier to entries in industries that are very competitive, for example. So once you have identified your barriers to entries, and once you have identified the market share of your industry, you will be able to determine which type of market structure your firm operates in. This is important to know the market structure because then you are able to determine what type of influence your firm has within that market, and it will help you provide the recommendations that you that are required at the end of this milestone. And this is when we move on. Once you've been able to identify the market structure, that's how you will be able to start discussing your recommendations. The recommendations in milestone 3 will be based on the research you've done in all 3 milestones, not just on the research that you've done for milestone 3. So make sure that you look at all the research you've done to provide your recommendations. The first recommendation is how the firm can manage its future production. So you're going to look at the data that you researched in milestone 2 regarding the demand and the supply trends, and you're going to be able to provide recommendation on how it should manage future production based on the demand and supply trends you researched. The second part of the recommendation is how the firm how can the firm influence the market, the industry. So the second part of the recommendation is mostly based on the research you've done about the market share, the barriers, and the structure the firm operates in. So if you're with Nike, it has a bigger share of the market, it has a bigger influence on the market. If your firm has a smaller share of the market, it might have a lesser influence on the market. So in the second recommendation, it's how the firm's positioning is affecting the firm's success in the market. And you want to give it some advice. You're going to provide some advice on how it can strengthen the position in the market. What can your firm do to strengthen the position? In the last part of the recommendation, you're going to comment and you're going to provide recommendation on how the firm can sustain its success. And here again, you're going to go back and look at the demand trends for the past 5 years, and you're going to discuss price elasticity. And so, how can it sustain its success? What are its pricing policies going to be here moving on? And you're just going to provide some additional recommendations. Now, I would like to make sure when you provide your recommendations, um, look for news articles, because sometimes they'll discuss your firm and there might have been some changes or some news flash about your firm that you might be using in your recommendations, and that you want to make sure your recommendations don't recommend something that is not feasible anymore or has already been done, um, and you're just not aware of it. For example, General Motors has been in the news lately. So if you have General Motors, for example, they've closed firms, they're closing factories and laying off employees because these factories are not producing models of cars that sell. And then there's speculation that the steel, the increased price of steel is also increasing the costs of keeping these factories open, which is not helping with, you know, containing the cost of these factories. So if you have General Motors, for example, you would consider this new development within your firm, within your company, while you give your recommendations. Tesla last year or recently has started. I don't know if they've already built it, but they started talking about building a pickup truck. So when you give your recommendations, that's something to consider. So, do a little bit of research on the news articles about your firm to make sure that your recommendations are in line with the latest news about your firm, if they have been in the news at all lately. Starbucks has the new policies that you can, has a few new policies enacted after they've been in the news about discrimination. So you might want to consider that if you're starting Starbucks in providing your recommendations, because that can affect demand trends for your firm, what customers expect, also an image of the products they purchase. So if this ends with the recommendations, we end milestone 3. You must include, if you continue from the previous milestone, then you already have the title page. If it's a self-standing file, you will have a title page, you will have the running headers, page numbers, and you will need to cite and reference all your sources accurately to meet the articulation of response and the APA requirements for the assignment. Do you have any questions? We have 10 minutes to answer questions, if you have any. Is there a way to copy your slides from milestone 2, 3, and 4 you presented in these presentations? What do you mean to copy the slides, Kenny? Which slides are you talking about? Because this is an essay. So, this file, Kenny, you can find this file in the final project supplemental resources in Brightspace. You can get the whole file, and then you'll be able to access the links that are included in it that are in blue if you want the additional materials. So this file is in your course to open and to read through and to use. You're having, Tamara says that she's having issues adding graphics in your document. Are you, the graphics like images that you're trying to copy and paste? You might want to, if you're opening like in Adobe, or if you have a Mac in Preview, you might want to make the image a little smaller, and then when you copy and paste it, it won't be quite as big in Word. but you should be able to paste it into Word with no problems. Rebecca, right-click on the blue link. If you right-click it and then you can open hyperlink, that might work. Once you paste in Word, Tamara, you can also reduce the size of the image by putting the mouse on the corner and dragging it to make it smaller. I don't know if that helps, but it should copy and paste without any problems. Sometimes you have to do the special paste, depending on what image or graph you're trying to paste in there. David is asking, for APA format, you're supposed to have the figures black and white. But what about cut and paste if you can't change the colors? I've had students put colors in their graphs and their pie charts. I mean, for the pie chart, you need a color. You can't do a pie chart without colors. I mean, otherwise you'd have shades of gray and it would be quite confusing. I don't think, I don't usually penalize if there's colors in the charts or the graphs. I doubt the other instructors would, but you, David, you can ask your instructor. Jeff, if you find a graph from a reliable sources for the cost of production, sure, go ahead and use it. And what you can do is then go in your income statement for your firm and verify that those numbers are correct or accurate, because you'll have to discuss them anyways in the content that you develop. So if the source is reliable, yeah, sure, you should use it. Sometimes you can find charts, pie charts, graphs, tables in news articles that discuss that firm or discuss that industry, and they can be helpful. I know Tesla has a pie chart for the market share that can be found on Google from one of the websites that a lot of students use. So yeah, Statistica can be good for that. Oh, you had problems finding that? Yeah, sometimes you might find older graphs depending on what firm you're researching, David. Kenny, Amazon started easy, but why just isn't such? Yeah, Amazon is not a good company to research. And I've already sent a note to the instructors that if students should be discouraged from researching Amazon because it's got too wide. So Kenny, if you're researching Amazon, you can narrow your research and focus either on Amazon Prime. I don't know what you did in Milestone 2, but you can focus either on Amazon Prime or focus on Amazon Books, just the sale of books, since that was their original business. That's how they started out. And this way you have a defined product that is being delivered, and you'll be able to ease your research. Yes, David, sometimes you have to make your own. There's ways to make it in Excel. You can copy and paste all the data in it, and it will produce the graph for you or a pie chart. Yes, Kenny, you just have to focus on one line of product. So Amazon Prime, and then you're in the video industry, like competing against Netflix, or Amazon Books, the book industry, I think, because otherwise the others is too many products. You would never be able to establish price elasticity and demand trends for the humongous array of products Amazon produces. Yes, Les. It's easier to create the graph in Excel if you can, just putting the numbers in and then getting it to do the graph. You're welcome, Kenny. We have a few more minutes for questions. If you have yeah, Excel to create the graph. Yes, you can create the graph in Excel and then migrate it into Word. The two software, they communicate somehow. I'm not proficient in Excel, but I have been able to create a graph, so I can tell you that it's not very difficult. Yes. As long as you have 2 columns of data, you'll be able to create a graph in Excel. And then copy it into Word, exactly. Thank you, Les. As I said, depending on the firm you're researching, look through the website of the firm. Sometimes they'll have charts that might not be in the most immediate financial reports part, apart besides looking in the financial reports, which you might have some graphs or some charts in there, but just skimming through the website. And sometimes you can find charts and graphs in news articles. There's news articles, some economists, journalists that focus on the economy. They'll sometimes use charts and graphs to illustrate their article, and you might be able to use it. Do we have any more questions? We have 5 more minutes. I see someone is typing. You can, if you're not sure how to create a graph in Excel, you can research it on YouTube. YouTube has a lot of excellent videos that help learning how to use some of the features in Excel, Word, PowerPoint that are very useful. Sometimes, depending on where you found the graph, you might have the option to export it, and then you can export to and choose Word, and then you'll be able to, it'll give you the graph in the format that works for Word. So you might be able to do that. I know we do that in macroeconomics. You might be able to do it on some of the websites that you use for micro. Yes. Yes, thank you, Les. If you go on YouTube, you will be able, if you want to, if you have trouble, let me know. You can email me at c.yates@snu.edu, and I can find you a video that looks appropriate for doing graphs in Excel. I would be happy to help you. I can change the cover sheet for each milestone right to the final one. Can you, or your example of discrimination Starbucks be used as an example as a barrier to entry? I don't think, Jeff, that the discrimination is a barrier to entry, because the discrimination wasn't against Starbucks. It was Starbucks perceived as an establishment that discriminates, which wouldn't be a barrier to entry to other coffee shops. In effect, it would be an incentive for other coffee shops if Starbucks was to lose, customers because of the articles in the news. So now that would not be a barrier to entry. David, in recommendation, can you just add to what they are already doing? For example, Tesla has the Gigafactory to drive down the battery costs, and that is their advantage right now. They will have the lowest cost for battery. Also, they can sell the batteries to other firms as well for additional revenue. So when David, you know this, so you can use this information to tailor your recommendations. So considering, you can consider this new Gigafactory and the cost of batteries and everything, and then you can tailor your recommendation. So you wouldn't repeat this because this is already being done. You're providing recommendations to the future. So you might have some ideas on how, thanks to this advantage, you can use it of how it has affected Tesla market positioning. And I think GM is closing the factories that produces its electric vehicles too, isn't it? So maybe that could be worth a mention. That some of the other automotive manufacturers are stepping back because of Tesla's advantage in the market. You can recommend that they sell the batteries to other firms if it's not something that they do already. Yes, that could be a good recommendation. If it's something they're not doing, then that could be worth it. We're closing down microeconomics. It's 9 o'clock, and we're going to switch to macro. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Good luck with Milestone 3. And I put my email in there if you want me to send you a link for a YouTube video on how to make graphs on Excel. I can look one up for you. You're welcome, Kenny. You're welcome, Dana. Let me find the Echo 202. Have a good evening. So welcome, macroeconomics students. We're now starting Milestone 3 for Echo 202. Milestone 3 focuses on monetary policies. So in Milestone 2, you have gone over fiscal policies and you've developed the 3 slides. You might not have feedback yet from your instructor since the milestones are back to back, but wait as much as you can to receive feedback from your instructor, because that feedback can be applied to Milestone 3 also, since the way the milestones are structured is very similar. The only difference is the focus on fiscal policies in Milestone 2 and monetary policies in Milestone 3. Going over some basic requirements for the PowerPoints. We know that you use the slides to provide the base, the highlights of the information, and then you will develop your content in the speaker notes. So the speaker notes is really where you're developing the bulk of your analysis, because you're only using the slides for key concepts, brief sentences, highlights, visual aids if you have graphs or charts or any kind of image that you want to help you with the milestone. The first slide for monetary policies is to find monetary policies that were enacted before your decade started and that carried their impact into your decade. So basically, you're framing the economy of your decade by using monetary policies from the past. So for example, one of the most obvious one is the 1980s. If you're doing the 1980s, you can examine the monetary policies of the 1970s, which were ineffective in curbing inflation. And by identifying those policies, you can explain that this is why the 1980s started with a still high level of inflation. In 1979, Volcker took over and started changing the stance of monetary policy. And so you can use the 1979 on as the new monetary policies in the following slide. So the first slide of monetary policies, just like the first one in Milestone 2, it examines the policies from the past. So if you are doing the era 2000, you wouldn't be identifying monetary policies of the year 2000, but you would finding monetary policies from the 90s. Some students go back a couple of decades because sometimes, the economy builds up to a certain point and there's multiple factors that have affected it. However, like for example, the inflation of the 80s, you can go back all the way into the 60s to find the culprits to the inflation of the 80s. So you're going back a few years because that is what allows you to frame your decade, and then you explain how your decade started. What were the levels, like maybe the unemployment or the GDP levels at the beginning of your decade. So you explain why your decade started the way it did. And in 2000, the decade started with a recession. For example, in the 90s, it started with a brief economic downturn also. You will see sometimes the decades always start like that for some reason. Moving on to slide number 2. In the second slide of monetary policies, this is where you focus on your decade. And this is where you will identify the monetary policies. Now, some decades have more monetary policies than others. So if you go into the 60s, for example, you will find that there's not a lot of important monetary policies enacted, mostly changes in interest rates, but a change in interest rate is a monetary policy. So you will identify those. Maybe you can use the chart, you have it from Milestone 1 that shows the fluctuations in the interest rates, and you can use that to explain why the rates were increased or decreased in certain moments of the decade, what the intent of those changes in interest rate were. Because that's what you're going to do. Once you identify the monetary policies, you have to explain the intent of the policy. Why was that policy enacted? Now, when we examine monetary policies, make sure you don't confuse monetary policies with other type of laws that were passed that might affect banks but are not monetary policies. The monetary policies are exclusively enacted by the Federal Reserve, and they're the tools that the Federal Reserve uses, which is the open market operations, so purchasing bonds to increase or selling bonds to increase and decrease the money supply, changing the federal funds rate or the discount rate to affect interest rates, and changing the reserve requirements. The reserve requirements have not changed for a long time. If you are doing a more recent decade, you will probably not find that they have changed the reserve requirements. So it will be mostly changes in the federal funds rate, changes in interest rate, and open market operations. Like in the 2000, there's a lot of open market operations. So those are the three types of policies you will find. Anything else like that is regulatory policies, like regulating how banks do transactions, that is not a monetary policy, so don't confuse it. That's not a monetary policy, that's not even a fiscal policy. There are some laws that are passed that are neither monetary nor fiscal policies, so you want to make sure you make that distinction. So once you have developed, you have identified the policies for your decade, you have explained in the speaker notes what the intent for those policies were. What was the Federal Reserve trying to achieve? I mean, right now, they talk a lot about the Federal Reserve talking about increasing interest rates. You might have heard on the news today because President Trump was criticizing the Federal Reserve, saying they're stunting growth, and the Federal Reserve, on their hand, is saying they are increasing interest rates because they don't want growth to get out of hand, because economic growth needs to be supported by a country that can sustain it. And so there's different points of view, but that's the intent of the policy. Now, the intent of the policy is not always the outcome of the policy, because things do not always go the way they should go. The economy changes from decade to decade, and although a lot of decisions are based on past trends and past models, it doesn't mean that those models will repeat themselves, because there's a lot of other factors that affect and influence the economy. Once you have identified the monetary policy actions, you can use models to also explain the intent and what those monetary policy actions are trying to achieve. Like, for example, the ADAS model. I encourage you to go in my econ lab and use the resources available there. If you go in my econ lab and identify the module, say for monetary policies, you will be able to download the PowerPoints that Hubbard made related to his chapters. And in those PowerPoints, there's very clear models of, for example, how a contractionary or an expansionary monetary policy would affect the economy in terms of shifts of the ADAS model and the new equilibrium. So you can use that graph, you can copy and paste it into your PowerPoint. You have to properly reference it, and you can use that graph to explain what the intent of the contractionary or expansionary monetary policies of your decade was. So you can use that. Now, in all these slides, I encourage you to cite your sources correctly, not only for the articulation of response, but also because to be exemplary in the final, you have to use scholarly research to support your content. So do it right away and you won't have to do it later in the final. The last slide you will develop is the monetary policy impact. So we know what impact the monetary policy should have because we have the models, we have the textbook, Hubbard tells us. However, those effects don't always pan out the way that the Federal Reserve wants to. So in this slide, you will actually examine the actual impact. So you will look at how those monetary policies affected inflation. Look at the numbers and the data that you researched in Milestone 1. You have it all there. It's available. You just need to look at your graphs and look at your numbers. And so when one monetary policy, so for example, there was an increase or a decrease in interest rates, what happened to inflation after? Did it affect unemployment? How did the GDP react to those changes? That's what you're gonna do in this slide, and that's what you're gonna develop in the content. You're gonna examine the impact using the data. You can use some examples if you can find them. The Federal Reserve is very rich in information regarding the monetary policies, history of the Federal Reserve, and even in discussing the impact of some monetary policies. So you might be able to find a lot of information that you can use in your content development. When you identify the impact, you also want to explain how businesses and individual households were affected by the monetary policy. When it comes to changes in interest rates, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if the interest rates were raised, for example, the corporate ones, how did that affect businesses? Everything is more expensive. Investments become more expensive. And you should be able to find the information of how businesses might have reduced their investments because of the high interest rates. The same with households. If the interest rates is higher, you might save more money because you're going to get more money from your savings. But if the interest rates it's lower, it's less worth saving, and it's less expensive to make big purchases like a house, a car, something where you need a loan. So consumption will increase. The sale of certain products will increase. So that's what you would be explaining in the monetary policy impact, and you want to make sure again that you explain how businesses and households were affected. It's a requirement of the rubric. So if you want to be exemplary for the final, you would definitely develop this part, and you want to integrate your data. You can use your models here if you want to also explain it, but you definitely want to integrate your data. So this is all for milestone 3. You won't have to do anything else but develop these 3 slides. As I said again, I mean, if you start working on your slides before you get feedback, because your instructor might just provide feedback on the weekends, you can develop your slides and maybe you can wait to see if you might get some feedback on the fiscal policy on milestone 2, and then integrate that feedback in your milestone 3 to make sure that you get a better grade, and that you do it correctly the first time so that you don't have to go back and rework it when you complete the final. As I said, go look at the rubric for the final. This way you know what the additional criteria are for the final to be exemplary, and you just work on them as you're working on milestone 3. And this means that when you're getting ready to do the final, instead of having to go back and reworking the milestones and the files you've already been on, you can focus entirely on the new slides you have to develop, which we'll go over when we do the webinar for the final project. We have a lot of time actually if you have any questions. Milestone 3 goes pretty fast since it's very similar to milestone 2. So if you have any questions, ask along, even if it's questions on the other milestones or something else, something about your decade. Take advantage We have another instructor, Bill, is here too, so he can provide some answers and some feedback if needed. I see someone is writing. It's really useful. Go on the Federal Reserve History website. It's a really good website to use to find out like how the monetary policies have affected the economy through the course of the decades. And then you can frame your decade, and from there you can find like the main lines that you want to develop your milestone on, and then deepen the research based on that information. I find that the Federal Reserve History website is one of the most informative when it comes to milestone 3. It even helps with milestone 2 because as it goes over monetary policies, it will mention fiscal policies. It mentions the economy as a whole, and so it can be really useful for milestone 2 also. A lot of times, although the Federal Reserve is independent and works independently of political pressure, they still will enact policies that reinforce fiscal policies that have been enacted, because the Federal Reserve wants the economy to boost just as much as the government does. Candice, you've pretty much answered the questions I already had. It's very similar to milestone 2. Yes, Candice, it's okay to reiterate the information from milestone 1 when you're describing the impact of the policies. It's okay to use the data. That's why you develop milestone 1, is to identify those trends for the decade and then be able to use them when you describe the impact of the monetary and the fiscal policies. I know a lot of you might have already integrated some mention of fiscal and monetary policies in milestone 1 when you were going over the trends of the GDP and the growth trends. So you might find that you might be a little bit repetitive, but it's okay. Sometimes it's better to be repetitive than to miss something because you didn't say it. So try not to like copy and paste anything from milestone 1 to here. Just rewrite it and express it within the framework of the milestone that you're doing and the flow of thought of your milestone. But you can use all that information from milestone 1 to see if the intent of those monetary policies was actually achieved. So, sometimes monetary policies occur also a little too late. For example, in the 2000, when the Federal Reserve started finally increasing interest rates to slow down the market because of the housing bubble, to slow down the housing market, it came a little bit too late, and we still had the housing bubble and the crash of that market. So the intent was there, but the timing was, was a little slow. They probably should have increased them. But also, what should have and could have been done is always a speculation because it didn't happen and it wasn't done. But the intent was not achieved. Gabriella says, I'm doing the 1960 and I found a really helpful source, but I did find information on a monetary policy in 1960s which affected the rest of the decade. You should, so Gabriella, you actually can use policies in the 1950s to show how it affected the 60s. And even if you don't find the specific policies of the 50s, you can use the trends of the monetary policies of the 50s. In the 1950s, there was a lot of concern to control inflation. So their monetary policies were always very focused on keeping inflation under control, which what happened is when you finally overlap into the 60s, it's like in the 60s they got sick of all the monetary policies in control of inflation and they let go of it, which then carried into the 70s. So what you can do, you still want to find something from the 50s, but you can find the trend of the 50s. which the trend was to control inflation, and the monetary policy was used to that purpose. And this you can explain how the 1960s started because of the policies of the 50s. So now the monetary policy in 1960, you will use it as your monetary policy action for your decade. Because see, if you use that one in the first slide, then you don't have it for the second slide. So somewhere you got to give. Candace says, I'm doing the 80s. The Volcker shock was a main point, but I haven't been able to find much more on the other monetary policies in the decade. So the it's not so much that it's subpar, Candace. It's that you're doing a whole decade, right? So the monetary policy enacted at the very beginning of the decade, like in Gabriella's case in 1960, or in your case, Volcker is 1979, and then he started enacting his policies, affect the first part of the decade, but the decade lasts until 1989. So you want to still find what the monetary policy stances were, later in the decade. So what you can go do, Candace, is you can go look at how interest rates changed towards in the second half of your decade. Because if you don't find any, big information about monetary policies, it's probably because there were just changes in interest rates. And the same will be for you, Gabriella. If you have a big monetary policy in 1960, you will find the 1960 is not rich in monetary policies, or in the sense that it doesn't have any important monetary policies that are worth mentioning. And so all you will do is go see how interest rates were changed. And what you can do is just give a general information of interest rates changed throughout the decade, and maybe highlight a few of the changes that might have been more relevant in affecting the economy. Yeah, because the 1960s are a little bit, I often have students saying, well, there were no monetary policies in the 60s, and they leave it to that, and then you're not getting a grade, because there's always changes in interest rates, even if they're minimal, or even if they're not, discussed a lot, but they do exist. And Gabriella and Candace, both of you, if you go on the Federal Reserve History website, and just put monetary policy of the 1970s, which is right the decade in between, you will find there's one article that does a big overview of the monetary policies all the way from the 60s to the 80s and how inflation was affected. And it's a really interesting article that someone wrote from the Federal Reserve that is very informative. Will give you a lot of information on the monetary policies of your decade. And then there's another one that Candace you can use that transitions the monetary policies from the 1970s into the 80s. And so you'll be able to use that to do your first slide. Yeah, you search the 1960s, but if you put it specifically in the Federal Reserve History website, you put the 70s, then it will give you that one article that goes all the way from the 60s to the 80s will come up. Somehow it comes up when you research. You can just write Federal Reserve History 1970s in Google, and then one of the websites it finds will be that article that does the overview, and then you get some information on the 60s. It might even mention the 50s briefly. So that's a really useful article that I run into from time to time. And it explains how the changes in monetary policies from the 70s to the 80s, how the focus changed, and why the policies of the 80s ended up being more successful than the one of the 70s to curb inflation. So the 1960s can be a little bit challenging for monetary policies, but they're very rich in fiscal policies, so you make it up that way. As compared to other decades that might have more monetary policies and maybe less interesting fiscal policies. We have a few more minutes for questions if you have any. You're welcome, Gabriella. If you have any more questions, Bill, I don't know if you have any suggestions on websites that can be used for monetary policies. Other good websites for monetary policies is to go the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research. There's a good article, I think, on the 50s, 60s, written by Manqui, that helps with the monetary policies. Yeah, Gabriella, you can't go like year by year changes in interest rates, so just find the ones that might have had a bigger impact on the economy, or that you can identify the impact using the data you have in milestone 1. You really want to have, if you can find 2 or 3 so that you cover the whole decade, one at the beginning, middle, end, that would be ideal, because then you can identify the monetary policies and the impact throughout the decade. That would, you want to make sure you cover the whole decade, though. You can't identify, even for the fiscal policies, you can't identify just one at the beginning of the decade and forget the end, because the effects of these policies may not last the whole decade, and you need to identify the other policies that were enacted and that affected the second part of your decade. Or sometimes students start from the second part and forget the whole first part too, which can happen. If there's, I see someone is typing. If we don't have any more questions, we can wrap it up. But I thought Gabriella was typing. It shows and it doesn't show. It shows you guys are typing, and then it takes like a few seconds for anything to appear, like a message or anything. I don't think it's instant or immediate when you guys write. But if you have any doubts about anything, I always encourage you to reach out to your instructor. Your instructors are there to help you navigate through the milestones and through the content, and they want you to be successful. They want you to, get a good grade at the end of the course. So reach out, ask questions. They're going to answer you. Oh, Randy, you're welcome. Yeah, see, Candace, I mean, even if you think it's a silly question, no questions is too silly. I encourage my students to ask me all the questions they want, and I answer all of them. There is no silly questions. All the questions are relevant, and if they help you develop your milestones and put your mind to peace, and decide how you're going to work your assignments, then you should ask those questions. And you should be getting an answer. If you want to, you can email me at cyates@snu.edu. If you email me, I can find you the article that I'm talking about of the Federal Reserve history, Gabriella and Candace, just in case you don't find it. Save my email and you can email me, and I'll be able to find it for you. Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I'm going to wrap it up then, because it looks like all the questions are answered for the monetary policy.